Martin, you've done a huge amount of work looking across all the data, across the sectors and categories, to pull out what's common between the brands in terms of making them successful. Could you give us a brief summary of what you found?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when we look at the data on this particular chart, the first number that jumps out is the decline of 20% in terms of category value change year on year. So that obviously set some alarm bells ringing to try and find an answer as to why that was. And the first thing that we noticed was actually the falling oil price globally. We've obviously had a dramatic fall, which has been in the news this year. That has had an influence on brand values as well. And we'll talk a bit about why that is. But if you think about oil and gas brands, obviously they're going to be affected, but also bank brands, because of their interest in oil majors, are also affected by that drop. But what we've seen really this year is the perfect storm in some ways, making the brand growth environment tougher than ever. We've had the oil price decline, we've had low interest rates, we've had slowing growth in China for the first time in the recent years. So actually, like I said, we've had that perfect storm, which has led to a difficult environment for brands.
So we've seen some not very good financial news for gas and oil and banks, and indeed it's a pretty up and down picture, isn't it, across a number of the categories?
Absolutely. And if we look at that on a category by category basis, certainly we see a very mixed picture. So at the bottom we see some of the categories that I've just talked about. So oil and gas brands, regional and global banks are also affected by oil prices, as we said, but also we've seen challenges in other categories. So cars, beer, luxury brands have all had a tough time over the course of the last year. But at the opposite end of the spectrum, there have been some categories that have managed to grow over the last year. So at the top of the list, we see apparel, and that's really driven by Under Armour in particular, which is a new entrant to the top 100 for the first time this year, but also a successful year for Nike and Adidas within apparel as well. Within fast foods, which has grown by 11% this year, we've seen that growth mainly driven by Starbucks, which I'll talk a bit about later, but that's had a stellar year of growth, and that's really driven the growth we've seen within the fast food category. And then finally, just to touch on telecom providers briefly, we've also seen growth in that category this year, and that's driven very much by the US, Verizon and AT&T seeing growth in particular.
So some fascinating differences by category, but when you take them together, what were the commonalities that you saw in terms of the major trends that you can pull out?
I think the main factor that jumps out as relevant to all categories is disruption and innovation. So it's something we've talked about before, but this year we've seen that it's increasingly important, if a category is going to grow, to contain disruptor brands, to contain true innovators. And three categories in particular to call out are apparel. So we've seen a strong year for Under Armour, as we've said, but certainly the growth of sportswear, the growth of leisure wear within apparel has been clear to see, and certainly an innovation in that particular category. We've also seen brands like Tesla entering the mainstream within the electric car market, and certainly are a challenger brand and a disruptor to that particular category. And finally, we've also seen within technology, brands providing cloud services have moved from a licensing model to a more subscription-based model. So a different way of innovating, a different way of bringing revenue to those brands, but certainly innovation nonetheless. But as I said, really, we could pick any category to talk about that you want. Disruption and innovation are really critical for success, for brand success. But that's by no means the only factor. So technology partnerships are increasingly important as well. And that's evidenced by the fact that within the retail top 10 brands, 50% of that value is actually owned by online brands. So evidence of the increasing importance of technology partnerships. And I think apps and mobile is an interesting one. So one we've talked about year after year. But increasingly, those offerings are becoming more of a hygiene factor. So within fast food, for example, it's important that brands are able to have some sort of application to let the customer start to think about and maybe even place their order on arrival at the restaurant to get around big queues, for example. Certainly McDonald's and Starbucks have embraced that side of the technology. Mobile is an interesting one, and we talk about brands being mobile ready, which is becoming increasingly important. And just this week I had an experience where I was trying to get hold of a boarding pass for an airline. This particular airline didn't have capacity to deliver that boarding pass to my mobile, which I actually found really frustrating, having to print it out. 2 years ago I would have just accepted that, but actually these days that frustration, I think, is symptomatic of what consumers are feeling and demanding across categories. So that's certainly an interesting one, and one that brands need to address if they are to be in a position to grow. Another category trend we're seeing emerge and become more important in an increasing number of categories is craft and choice. So I think within beer brands specifically, that's something we've talked about for a few years, but it is becoming more of an issue. There's a prevalence, there's a proliferation of craft brands within that particular category that are challenging the mainstream established beer brands. Brands like BrewDog in the UK is a good example. Also within colas as well. So obviously Pepsi and Coke have had a global monopoly within cola for a number of years, but increasingly we're having more challenger brands within cola. But that's not to say craft and choice and the proliferation of choice is limited to drinks brands. We're also seeing the same within a number of categories, cars and grocery and others too. So certainly that trend is something that brands should be aware of. Connecting with young consumers, connecting with the young middle class in particular, is an increasing challenge for brands globally, and we see that the habits and the tastes of those consumers are beginning to change as well. So they're becoming increasingly health focused, increasingly focused on the environment and looking after the planet, and it's really brands that can ride the zeitgeist in that respect, tap into those trends that are really going to be the brands that can connect with those consumers and grow into the future. And then finally, a trend that underpins all of them is data privacy and security. So we know that transparency is important, we know that trust is important, and it's brands that can protect our data in a transparent way that are going to build that trust and be in a better position to really grow in value.
So there's a lot of commonality, and I guess the one thing is that it's not enough just to copy your competitors. It's about learning to be meaningfully different, but from all sorts of brands and categories, and that's the way forward.
Yep, absolutely agree.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.